to Decision Makers. I'm Charles Ellison, your host and executive producer. We now have joining us former Colorado State Senate President Peter Groff. He also heads up the Masters in Public Policy Administration program at the University of Redlands. He joins us here now for Decision Makers. And it's always good to see you, Peter. Thanks so much for your time.
Thanks for having me on, my friend.
All right, good. So talk about that experience in governance, and talk about the events that led up to becoming Senate President.
Well, first you have to have the majority, obviously. We did a really good job when we were in the minority of showing contrast between what it would look like if Democrats had control of the Senate and what it was looking like as Republicans had control of the Senate, and did a really good job of showing legislation that they were defeating either in committee or on the floor. And we were saying, here's exactly what this is going to do. And if something was defeated in committee, we'd have a press conference right there outside the committee room. If we lost something on the floor, we'd head outside the Capitol and say, Colorado, this is what they just killed. So we did a really good job of showing that contrast. And so we attempted to do that once we got the majority. And I kind of helped put together a lot of the plans and a lot of the talking points and helped to show and get folks to really come down and testify. So it really put a face on what we were trying to do. And so I was president pro tem once we got the majority, and did that for a couple of years, and really shepherded through some transformative pieces of legislation. The president decided she would run for Congress, and so that left open that office, and then I ran for it and won it, and really tried to do the same thing. I'm somebody who believes that government really kind of should be an active tool so that we can create opportunity, that we can secure and maintain justice. And we just ran legislation kind of based on those ideas.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever really gotten into this conversation with you about not just what that historic moment meant, because it was a historic moment because you were the first Black president of the Colorado State Senate, or the first, and really the first, you were the first non-white president of the Colorado State Senate. So what was the reaction to that? And that was happening at the same time that the House, the Colorado House, also installed its first Black president, or first Black House Speaker.
Yeah, there was a lot of historic first going on when we got the majority. So the president that I replaced was a woman, and so we had our first woman president. I then followed her as the first African American speaker, only the third at the time in the United States to have ever hold the gavel as African American in Senate president. And so what was also unique about that is I was the only African American in the chamber. And so there were times when I would look out, and you've been involved in politics, so you know, and worked for elected folks, you know that the lobby is kind of where a lot of stuff gets done. There were no African Americans really in the lobby either. And so when I came in, it was certainly unique. The next year, Terrence Carroll was elected House Speaker. So it was the first time in the history of the country where two African Americans, post Reconstruction, I'll say that, were running the legislature. And so certainly unique challenges, but great opportunities. We made sure that we diversified our office staff. I had an African American LGBTQ plus person as a chief of staff. My policy director was an African American male. My deputy policy director was an African American female. Our chief communications person was a Latina. So we brought a lot of hue to the chamber, but I think it really reflected where the state was. And I think it also allowed me to make sure that kind of I was grounded in what needed to be done for people of color in the state and those who are suffering. And so, I think if you have the opportunity to be in that position, I think you want to make sure that you have folks who look like you and understand kind of the issues and challenges, kind of to be there with you as you go through that journey.
You've talked about the importance of having folks in office who look like you. You've talked about the need for diversity, for inclusion and governance. Before we get a little bit into that, let's talk about the definition in your mind of good governance. You talked about that a few moments ago, like if there is such a thing these days, right? But I want to explore what good governance means to you, what effective governance means to you.
I think it's different for me as an urban legislator, former urban legislator, of what good governance looks like in terms of ensuring that legislation that comes through the process is
Mhm.
going to either create opportunity or maintain and secure justice, right? And really begin to work on the equity pieces that are lacking throughout either rural areas or even urban areas. And so ensuring that legislation really looks to move people forward. So that for me is kind of good governance, making sure that everybody has an opportunity to talk about it, to make it sure it goes through the process in the way that the rules allow. I was not one necessarily to shut down or try and embarrass Republicans or try to one up Republicans because I had 18 votes. And in the Senate, that's what you need. So ultimately, I would have 18 votes. Pretty soon, we were able to move the majority to the largest majority at the time in the history of Colorado, a Democratic majority of 21. So there were lots of opportunities. We had to really push through stuff when we can allow a vote or two to go. But for me, it was ensuring that everybody in that chamber, Democrat or Republican, had the opportunity to talk about the issues because they were duly elected. So they could come down to the well. But I always knew, one, I had the rules in my back pocket if things got sideways.
Yeah.
But most importantly, I had 18 votes. And so again, it was about the contrast between what we were offering and what our opposition was offering, but allowing folks to have that conversation, going by the rules and sending it either on to the House or on to the governor.
So, what's your thought on what's transpiring in legislatures like the US Congress, and I know you're watching other state legislatures as well, where we have an intense amount of partisanship that's happening, right? Like, how bad do you think it is? And is there any real historical precedent to the intensity of polarization that we're seeing in legislative bodies like the US Congress, like other state legislatures as well? The intense divide between Democrat and Republican, the inability to, it seems, the perception that there's that legislators, policymakers are unable to get things done. How bad do you think it will get?
Well, a couple of things. One, I think kind of historically, I don't think this it's been as bad as kind of pre Civil War and
Mm.
then kind of post Reconstruction as folks were coming back in to the Union, where it was relatively partisan then. But since then, I'm not sure we've seen this level of partisanship and gamesmanship and showmanship in Washington. And I think that's gonna be. I was gonna say it's gonna be a problem. It's gonna be an even bigger problem if they kind of continue down that road. The
Mm.
U.S. Congress is broken, and they refuse to change the rules to allow a much more effective and efficient process.
Mm.
The rules are so arcane, and the calendar is so arcane that it really doesn't allow folks to come together, stay together, and work through issues.
Mhm.
It will be interesting to see as we record this earlier this morning. A ship crashed into the Francis Key Bridge
Mm.
in Baltimore. A highway fell down, collapsed. I think it was 35 West in Minnesota in
I remember that.
2007. It took 5 days for the Congress to move a bill from the time that that crashed. I think the crash was August 1st. By the 6th or 7th, George W. Bush signed a bill to
Mhm.
rebuild that bridge. It will be interesting to see what happens over the course of the next several months,
Right.
maybe even years, to see Congress move sufficient dollars so that Maryland can rebuild that bridge. The problem, I think, is generally at the federal level. I think states are more and more becoming a reflection of that as people kind of look to move up to Congress. And so when I was in the legislature, yes, it was partisan. But we also knew that by the rules, every bill had to be heard. Every bill had to have an up or down vote. If it passed committee, then every bill had to be argued on the floor. We couldn't pocket veto anything. We didn't have rules committees. The rules were the rules, and we knew that. But again, we had the majority. And so I think that the issue is you're now seeing states kind of try and follow the lead um, of Washington, and I think that's the bad direction to go. Overwhelmingly, states have been these kind of incubators of democracy and laboratories of democracy, where you see a lot of innovation and a lot of kind of new opportunities come through. And I think states are beginning to lose that because they're trying to be too partisan.
There is this tendency, right, for the general public to shrug these sorts of activities or to shrug intense polarization or the gap, the divide between Democrats and Republicans as just politicians being messy, right? And it it has the what ends up happening, or from what we're seeing, is that it causes or it prompts the general public to disengage from politics and public policy. How do we get the public fully engaged and aware? And with that disengagement, people tend to remove themselves from the political process, especially young people who say, for example, young people who will say, "I'm not going to vote." How do we get the public fully engaged and much more aware in these politically messy times?
That's a great question, and I'm not sure I necessarily have the answer, because I think the answer lies within the legislators themselves,
Hmm.
to look and see that the support that they may have through their constituencies is not there. Yeah, they might be winning elections, but the engagement of the public, the expectations of the public aren't there. And so you can really literally do anything, as we've seen at the federal level. When you don't like a speaker and you don't like one thing that that person does, you throw them out. That's not efficient. It's not effective.
Hmm.
But people are like, well, that's just what Congress does. So it's really up to Congress and state legislators to say we can do better. There are issues that we need to discuss, that we need to solve, and they need to begin to discuss and solve those. That's the way you bring folks back in. We can't just say, oh, we'll do better. We have to kind of show that we can do better or that they can do better. Then I think people become engaged. But for people who are looking at this who aren't in the legislature, you have to press your person, your elected official, to do better at the federal level, at the local level, and at the state level. Because if they don't feel that pressure, we see what happens in Washington. To your point, that folks are just disengaged and they don't care. And that's going to be that's dangerous for democracy, and it's dangerous for those folks who need government to work.
What makes for a good legislator, right? In the context of a legislator's relationship with his or her constituent.
I think with regard to your constituent, it's constituent relations. You know, if somebody needs something, you go out and you get it done and you make government work for them.
Mhm.
So that's one piece. I think kind of the broader question is legislators need to understand that it's not only if someone calls, but it's kind of what they see on the news. It's what they hear from their neighbors,
Mm.
right? And so it's a broader conversation about kind of how you appear in terms of your constituents, right? But in terms of the connection between you and your constituents, it's making government work for them, right? If somebody is having an issue with some state agency, or they can't get the permit office at the city level to work, or at the federal level, they can't get Social Security to answer the phone, that's when the staff that you have, that's when the legislator has to make the call and has to make government work.
Mm. Peter, there's also the specter looming over governance of media and social media. it seems like there's a consensus forming. You know, you're even saying that, you know, obviously, we're dealing with some very rough, very contentious times as far as governance is concerned. A lot of governance is being corrupted by media, social media. How much? How do we manage that?
Um, I tell the classes that I teach, either in the communication class that I teach, or one on leadership, or one on decision making, just about any class that I teach, that I think that social media is the devil. And they're much younger than me, so they're like, well, here's the guy on his soapbox talking about it. But I think what social media has been allowed to do, and the Supreme Court is discussing this, and there were pieces of legislation at the congressional level discussing this, banning certain platforms, just the misinformation and disinformation that's out there. Many young people don't sit and watch the news as you and I do, right? So when I was growing up, there were three channels. So that tells you, three networks. It tells you how long ago it was. And there was news at 6 or 6:30, right? And so you listen to Walter Cronkite or Brinkley and Huntley or whomever you watched, and you said, okay, here's the information. What do I do with this?
Mhm.
But as we've gotten to this point where everybody can kind of be a journalist, or everybody has an opinion, now you get information either that people don't understand the issue, or they are specifically giving misinformation, trying to have people look a different way as other things are going on. And I think that's the problem. And I'm not necessarily, I don't know how you fix that
Right.
unless you allow platforms to say this is wrong, or here is something else that you might want to check. And then that gets us into kind of First Amendment areas. But I think that folks have to kind of make sure that what they're looking at is an actual traditional source. Journalists have to be much more engaged in their journalistic skills. I think we have to move away from the opinions that we see most often on cable news, regardless of what cable news network you're watching. There's a lot of opinions and not necessarily a lot of news sharing or information sharing. And I think we have to kind of get back to that. So we have a sense of um, a common set of information, a common set of truths that we can then move on.
We've been joined by former state senator Peter Groff, also former president of the Colorado State Senate, and he is also directing the Masters in Public Policy Administration at the University of Redlands, joining us here on Decision Makers. I want to thank our partners, Council of State Governments East, also Learn for Life, and the Smart Services Coalition, and others. I'm Charles Ellison. I'm your executive producer, host here on Decision Makers. We'll see you next time.